for April 10th, 2021. On March 12th, 2021, the New York Times published an article that turns an abuse of power on the part of Jedediah Wheeler and Montclair State University, open parenthesis, capital M, capital S, capital U, end parenthesis, peak performances, to a, quote, he said / she said, end quote, tale about, quote, misunderstandings, end quote, and, quote, interpretations, end quote. In an attempt to be, quote, neutral, end quote, the article itself is an abuse of power on the part of the, quote, paper of record, end quote. Inspired by Rachel Cargill and Alexandra Bell, we take the article to task. Scroll through to see our edits. A PDF of the original New York Times article, our solidarity statement and calls to action, and audio recordings for this post are linked in our bio. Image descriptions. Image 1. Square image with black background and 2 lines of bold, all capitalized, hot pink text centered in the image. In large font, the first line has the letters N, Y, T with an asterisk following the T. The second line, in smaller font, begins with an asterisk followed by the letters C, N, F, and the word, quote, edit, end quote. Image 2. Black text on a white background of an outline NY Times article with pink strike-through lines over text and pink text on black highlight as rewrites. The New York Times logo is seen across the top. Below that, the title, quote, a rift over art and activism ripples through the performance world, end quote, is crossed out, and below that is a rewrite, quote, white supremacist gatekeeping highlights continued colonial harm, indigenous extraction at Montclair State University, end quote. Then, the body of the article begins, quote, a dispute between the, end quote, is crossed out, rewritten as, quote, abusive behavior perpetuated by Jedediah Wheeler, end quote. The line continues, quote, director of peak performances, and an indigenous choreographer hinged on, end quote, in which, quote, and an, end quote, is crossed out and rewritten, quote, toward, end quote, and, quote, Emily Johnson, end quote, is inserted after, quote, choreographer, end quote. The line continues completely crossed out, quote, workplace behavior, power, and the boundary between art and social justice, end quote, and is written, quote, refusal to enact decolonization processes and artist funding transparency, end quote. Image 3. Black text on a white background that reads, quote, but Johnson did not join that roster. Not long after the conference, Johnson asked Wheeler in a phone conversation for his, quote, personal commitment to a decolonization process, end quote, she later wrote. She suggested that peak performances begin a land acknowledgement by taking a series of steps to recognize the original inhabitants of the area, forge relationships with other indigenous artists, and engage First Nations students on campus, among other things, end quote. Around the words, quote, original inhabitants, end quote, are two hand-drawn red brackets and a number 1 hovers to the right of the bracketed words. The text continues with, quote, Wheeler saying that peak performances could not set policy since it was only a small part of a larger university, reacted dismissively and then, when pressed, angrily, end quote. The words, quote, could not set policy, end quote, are underlined with a red line and a number 2 hovers to the right of the underlined words. The word, quote, angrily, end quote, is circled red and a number 3 hovers to the right of the circle. Following the large paragraph of text is a red line running horizontally the length of the image, separating the top half from the bottom. The bottom half has numbers 1, 2, 3 in red, followed by text in black that explains the corresponding numbers from the top half. Text reads as follows. 1. Egregious erasure of the diasporic Lenape nations, particularly in the context of an article that exists because the request for such recognition was violently denied. 2. NYT sides with the patriarchal institution and yields power to MSU in ways that are only convenient to white supremacy, as opposed to reporting on Johnson's request, which was to engage in dialogue, not to set policy. 3. NYT lacks both the questioning and analysis on white rage and defensiveness in the face of being called in. Image 4. Black text on white background that reads, quote, Wheeler said he had been, quote, shocked and hurt, end quote, by the letter, end quote. The words, quote, shocked and hurt, end quote, are underlined in red, and a red number 4 hovers above the words. The text continues with, quote, he acknowledged mishandling the situation, but, quote, white rage, end quote, he asked, quote, it's so inaccurate. Look at the artists I've supported, end quote. Around the words, quote, look at the artists I've supported, end quote, are two hand-drawn red brackets, and the number 5 hovers to the right of the bracketed words. The text continues with, quote, what happened is that I made a mistake, end quote, he added. Quote, I didn't really know what Emily was asking. I take full responsibility for not hearing her, end quote. The word, quote, mistake, end quote, is underlined in red twice, and the number 6 hovers to the right of the underlined word. Following the large paragraph of text is a red line running horizontally the length of the image, separating the top half from the bottom. The bottom half has numbers 4, 5, 6 in red, followed by text in black that explains the corresponding numbers from the top half. Text reads as follows. 4. NYT fails to point out the hypocrisy of Wheeler's statements. Wheeler exercises white fragility and self-victimization in reflecting on his abuse of power at MSU peak performances. 5. Does Wheeler's referencing of, quote, support, end quote, excuse a history and culture of silencing staff and artists, normalizing harmful behavior in a work environment, and withholding contracts and payment to artists? 6. In NYT's complacent reporting, they chose to not challenge Wheeler's lack of accountability and lack of remorse. Prior to this article, Wheeler had months to take responsibility and rectify the situation, but instead remained silent and ignored how his actions caused Emily Johnson harm. Image 5. Black text on white background that reads, quote, "It was within this broader, volatile context that her letter detonated," end quote. The word, quote, "detonated," end quote, is underlined in red, and the number 7 hovers to the left of the underlined word. The text continues with, quote, "More than 100 nonprofit performing arts presenters, including some of the most prominent, have signed an online statement of solidarity calling, quote, for accountability and repair, not only in this case, but in our field at large," end quote. And more than 1,000 arts workers have signed a similar call to action, open parenthesis, quote, "We are all implicated," end quote, close parenthesis, with a long list of proposals to address both Johnson's experience and more general issues of contracts and funding that it raises, end quote. Hand-drawn red brackets frame the last sentence, starting with, quote, "We are all implicated," end quote, which is underlined in red, and the number 8 hovers to the right of those words, and the brackets end around the word, quote, "raises," end quote, which is also underlined in red. Following the large paragraph of text is a red line running horizontally the length of the image, separating the top half from the bottom. The bottom half has numbers 7, 8 in red, followed by text in black that explains the corresponding numbers from the top half. Text reads as follows. 7. In reporting on Emily Johnson's actions and letter, NYT uses violent colonizer language, while nothing surrounding Jed Wheeler's anger and violence is afforded the same level of aggressive connotation. 8. NYT lazily frames the solidarity statement that arts workers rallied behind in response to the harm Jed Wheeler and MSU peak performances caused. None of the calls to action for MSU are specifically mentioned. Image 6. Black text on white background that reads, quote, "Montclair State issued a statement defending Wheeler, noting that peak performances, quote, intentionally seeks out emerging artists, artists from underrepresented backgrounds, and artists whose work challenges established norms and practices," end quote. Around the words, quote, "artists whose work challenges established norms and practices," end quote, are hand-drawn red brackets, and the number 9 hovers to the right of the bracketed words. The text continues with, quote, "It's stated that Wheeler, as the leader of, quote, only one of many hundreds of units and programs," end quote, at the university, lacked the authority to agree to Johnson's proposals. It said that the university's, quote, "robust," end quote, social justice and diversity policies were established at the institutional level, end quote. Following the large paragraph of text is a red line running horizontally the length of the image, separating the top half from the bottom. The bottom half has the number 9 in red, followed by text in black that explains the corresponding number from the top half. Text reads as follows: 9. NYT upholds institutional rightness by citing Peak Performance's mission statement without challenging their commitment or lack thereof to their own mission. Emily Johnson, in bold all caps, is, end bold all caps, an artist, quote, challenging their norms and practices, end quote. Image 7. Black text on white background that reads, quote, "What happened?" In interviews, Johnson and Wheeler disputed some facts, but the difference in their stories lie more in interpretation. What the other side meant, who should have understood what, and when, what is and is not acceptable, end quote. The word, quote, interpretation, end quote, is underlined in red, and the number 10 hovers to the left of the underlined word. The text continues with, quote, Wheeler first took an interest in Johnson in 2018 when she wrote an essay for the organization's publication, the Peak Journal. Quote, she asked a question that to my ears was profound and brave, end quote. He said, quote, which is, quote, whose land did you steal, end quote, end quote. Open parentheses. What she actually wrote was, quote, do you know whose land you are on, end quote, close parentheses. Quote, could that force be captured in a performance, end quote. He said he asked himself, end quote. The words, quote, captured in a performance, end quote, are underlined in red, and the number 11 hovers to the right of the underlined words. Following the large paragraph of text is a red line running horizontally the length of the image, separating the top half from the bottom. The bottom half has the number 10 and 11 in red, followed by text in black that explains the corresponding number from the top half. Text reads as follows: 10. NYT gaslights, turns patriarchal dominance and white supremacy into an, quote, interpretation, end quote. NYT is complacent towards the abused and does not prioritize accountability from those in power. 11. Here, both tokenism and capitalism collide. Wheeler assumes, on behalf of Johnson, how her labor and process might be shared as a means of monetizing for an institution. Image 8, final image. Black text on white background that reads, quote, I do call the shots, end quote, Wheeler said in an interview, end quote. Did he scream and hang up? Quote, sometimes I don't hear what I'm saying the way others hear it, end quote. He said, the words, quote, I do call the shots, end quote, are circled in red, and the number 12 hovers above the circled words. Hand-drawn brackets in red frame the words, quote, sometimes I don't hear what I'm saying the way others hear it, end quote, and the number 13 hovers to the right of the bracketed words. The text continues with, quote, that's not unusual for me. I was frustrated that there was no recognition of the limitations of my office, and I left the call. End quote. Following the large paragraph of text is a red line running horizontally the length of the image, separating the top half from the bottom. The bottom half has numbers 12 through 13 in red, followed by text in black that explains the corresponding numbers from the top half. Text reads as follows: 12 through 13. NYT fails to take Wheeler's settler, colonial, and internalized white supremacy statement to task. Jed Wheeler exercises willful ignorance, doubles down on patriarchal condescension, and acknowledges harmful actions as a product of a fleeting moment of misunderstanding, rather than the sustained wielding of power and violence over a BIPOC artist that it is.